All right, let's go ahead and open up with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you so much for this day. I pray that that this will edify the church, Lord. I pray that we'll just have a great day and a great time of fellowship. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's go ahead and I'm going to start with Bible verse. So we got to start with Bible verse. So if you brought your Bibles, go ahead and open up to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. And for those of you who don't know and just stumbled in unawares, this is the Ar15 familiarization class. We're also going to do some cleaning later. I'm going to start out with a kind of a short history of the, what led up to the Ar15 M16 family of rifles and just kind of what they are and how they work. And Luke chapter 22, verse 36, it says, "Then said he unto them, But now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." And the reason why I picked that verse is that that's Jesus actually telling his disciples that they need to buy a sword. If they don't have one, that they should buy one. And so I think that every Christian man should have the ability to protect his family. And I personally believe that the AR-15 is a really good tool for that. And I'll kind of go into why. But the reason why I point that one out specifically is that he says, hey, if you don't have a garment, or if you don't have a sword, sell your garment and buy one. And most people don't know this, but at the time, unless you were a Roman citizen, you couldn't actually own a sword. And so Jesus was actually telling them to do something that wasn't legal. And so that means that if your government tells you you can't own something to protect yourself, it's not a sin for us to break that law. So let me start now with kind of some of the history of the AR-15 rifle. I'm going to start off actually a lot sooner than 1964 when it was adopted. So we're going to go back into the 1930s. In the 1930s, the U.S. military at the time had a rifle that was a bolt-action rifle. It was based on the Mauser design. It fired the standard 30-06 cartridge, or we call it now the 30-06. It was a turn bolt rifle, so that means that you would fire the rifle and turn the bolt, and it would manually work the action, and it was a repeater. It had an internal 5-round box magazine. In the 1930s, the school of thought was leaning more towards an auto-loading rifle, and what that basically means is that every time you pull the trigger, some sort of function of the round going off, whether it's recoil or gas energy, actually recycles the weapon and loads it ready to fire again. And so to that end, in 1936, they adopted, the U.S. military adopted the 30 caliber rifle as a U.S. rifle, caliber 30 M1. And it was designed by a gentleman named John C. Garand, and he was a naturalized American citizen. And it's a pretty cool rifle. It was the first a rifle that was adopted by any major power for the entire military that was an automatic rifle. So every time you pulled the trigger, the gas system would cycle the bolt, and it would actually eject an empty cartridge and then load a cartridge ready to fire. So this used what's called an 8-round, it used the same caliber, 30-06, and it used an 8-round M-block clip. And this was basically a piece of pressed steel that held 8 30-06 cartridges. And you'd load it in from the top, and then you could fire 8 shots, and then on the last round, it would eject the steel clip that fed the gun. And then you could load in a new one and you'd be ready to go. So this was the first mass-adopted auto-loading rifle, and it was very high quality, and it worked very well. In a time when auto-loading rifles were only, really, if you had a rifle that fired 200 rounds and you only had 10 stoppages back in the 1930s, that you were doing good. And this rifle surpassed everyone's expectations in being very reliable. I mean, these guns can fire probably 100 to 200 rounds before you have any effects when it gets actually dirty enough to make it so the gun doesn't work. It does have some things about it. The fact that the bolt is open There's a track along the side that if dirt gets into, it's not going to function. There are some shortcomings to this rifle, but in 1936, this was the gold standard, okay? And our military adopted it. This is a rifle we used during World War II and through the Korean War. And after the Korean War, we, our military, or the Ordnance Department, started looking around for something that was a little lighter weight and could hold more ammunition. And the reason why they did that is because in the 1940s, late 1940s, a gentleman named Mikhail Kalashnikov developed this. This, and most people don't even have to have me tell them what it is an Avtomat Kalashnikov model of 1947, or an AK-47. And the AK-47 was originally designed in 1947, but it wasn't really mass produced until the early 50s. And because Russia was kind of our nemesis, this was the gun that we kept seeing over and over again in our battlefields. And this gun is really pretty phenomenal. It fires a relatively short intermediate cartridge. The M1 rifle fired a very large 7.62 by 36 millimeter cartridge, the 30-06, and the Russians decided to go with the 7.62 by 39, which was less recoil. But the thing is that I can carry a lot more of these, and this is very effective out to 300 yards, because they found out during World War I in Korea that the ranges that people were fighting at were less than 300 yards. And so why would you need to have a rifle that is capable of 1,000 yards when all the fighting you're doing is close range? What you're doing is it weighs more, the ammunition weighs more, and the other, and probably the biggest reason why they had a problem with the M1 was that they wanted to do fully automatic fire. And the AK-47 is very controllable on fully automatic. It fires from a 30-round box magazine, so you got plenty of ammunition. And like I said, this was coming out in the 1950s. And so in the 1950s, we still had this, which is heavy, only holds 8 rounds, it's not fully automatic. And so the Ordnance Corps said, well, we're going to update this rifle. And so what they did is they developed what's called the M14 rifle. And the M14 is basically an M1 with a 20-round box magazine, a shortened gas system, and a slightly shorter and lighter bullet. So the bullet they adopted, they went from 7.62 millimeter by 36 millimeter to 7.62 by 51. It's about 11% smaller. But because of the advancements in powder, it pretty much has the same velocity. It has the same projectile weight. It's just more technologically advanced. Well, the problem is the intermediate cartridge was still quite a bit smaller than this. And the M14, based on the old M1 design, was absolutely uncontrollable in fully automatic. I've fired an M14 in fully automatic. I don't care how big you are. I don't care how good you are at holding a gun. Once you pull that trigger, everything blurs. Your sights blur and the gun just goes straight up because you cannot control it. It's uncontrollable in fully automatic fire. And at the time, you know, we were heading into Vietnam, and Vietnam was a war of ambushes. And in the ambush, you want to get fire out as much as possible. Basically, if you get ambushed, you want to shoot back as fast as possible, and that's how you're going to win the battle. And the M14 wasn't good at that because you really couldn't fire it fully automatic. And the M14 was adopted in 1956. So from 1936 to 1956, the M1 rifle was standard issue. And then in 1956, they adopted, 1959. In 1959, they adopted the M14, which is basically the updates to the M1. And it had the shortest life of any U.S. service rifle. And the reason why I'm telling you all this is because I kind of want you to know how this was all developed, because it kind of shows you why I think the M4 or the M16 or the Ar15, they all kind of, you can use that name pretty much interchangeably because they use the same operating system, is a much superior weapon to something like this and is much more geared to personal protection than an M1. So in 1959, something else was going on. They adopted the M14, which was to compete with the AK-47, which it did poorly. And something else happened in the 1950s, and that was a gentleman by the name of Eugene Stoner, who was a kind of a garage gun tinkerer, and he used a lot of composite material and aluminum material to manufacture guns, make them really lightweight and robust. Because at the time, aerospace aluminum was coming. I mean, everyone was using aluminum, and aluminum pound for pound was stronger than steel. So if you can lighten up a gun, but it's still really strong, you're going to be more effective. Just because it's lighter weight, it's easier to control. There are a lot of advantages to making it lighter. So in the 1950s, he developed a rifle called the AR-10 for the Armalite Company, which was a division of the Fairchild Aircraft Manufacturing Company. And it was a very lightweight rifle that fired the .7.62 caliber cartridge, the AR-10 did, a full-size cartridge. It was a lot more controllable than an M14, but it still wasn't what the military was looking for. Later in 1959, that rifle, the AR-10, was taken and it was downsized and turned into the AR-15. And this was the first time you saw the term AR-15, which actually stands for Armalite Rifle Model 15. It actually doesn't stand for assault rifle. So the Armalite rifle was really great because it fired a new cartridge, which was a lot more like the Russian intermediate cartridge. It was a 5.56 millimeter cartridge, and as you can see, it's very similar in terms of its overall size. And what this is really going to do is the recoil goes way down, so it's much more controllable in automatic fire. And let me tell you, getting hit by one of those, that's a 55 grain projectile going at 3,000 feet per second. When it hits your body, it blows itself apart and makes hundreds of wound channels, and you bleed to death. And contrary to Hollywood, which shows if you get shot by a gun, you go flying 10 feet back, that's not what happens. You kill someone, with a gun by making them bleed to death. And so if you can do that better, then that's what you want to do. And that's what the 5.56 millimeter cartridge did really well. So in 1959, this rifle came out. The Armalite was having some issues with financing because they couldn't really get anyone interested in it. And they'd never sold anything to the military. They were not a military gun provider like a Winchester or a Colt or someone like that. And so they actually sold the rights to this rifle to the Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company. And Colt, which already had military contracts because they were providing the .45 caliber pistol to the Army, they did some updates to it. They changed the position of the charging handle. They did a couple things to it to make it a little bit better, and then they kind of put it out there for people to test. And really, the way you get a gun adopted in any military is you impress the generals. You basically show up at a general's house and you say, "Hey, look at this toy," and they either like it or they don't. Well, they showed up to General Curtis LeMay's house, who was the general of the Air Force. And they did a display with this rifle and a bunch of watermelons. And those watermelons, when they get hit, because they're mostly water, they explode. And it's very impressive. And he ordered 80,000 of them on the spot. Well, he thought they would be great to defend airfields, and they would. But the Ordnance Department didn't like that. So they basically squashed the deal. And then Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, heard about that and saw this rifle, saw it was really great, and he told the Ordnance Corps that they were going to adopt these. And so in 1964, 6 years after the adoption of the M14, they adopted the M16 rifle. And this rifle went on to be used in Vietnam very successfully. This rifle is very lightweight. I mean, the original rifles are somewhere around 6.5 pounds. This thing weighs less than 7 pounds fully loaded. In fully automatic, this is very easy to control. Getting off bursts is very simple. It's easy to use. It stays relatively clean, contrary to popular belief. And it's almost a soldier-proof rifle too, because as you'll see when we're doing the cleaning demonstration, it only breaks down into about 5 pieces, whereas the old M1 breaks down into about 40 pieces. Very easy to get lost, very easy to get broken, a lot of small pieces. So in 1969, there were some revisions. They revised the rifle to the M16A1. They added a chrome lined bore and chamber. They added the forward assist, which you see on this, and I'll explain that when we do the familiarization part. And they just added some improvements to the rifle. This rifle was originally adopted in 1964, and it stayed in ordnance, some version of the M16, all the way until I believe 2012. So from 1964 to 2012 is a pretty good run. And as you'll see, the rifle that actually replaced this one was basically just this rifle, a little different. So it actually is pretty much the same. In 1986, they updated the rifle again, put a heavier barrel on it, changed the sight a little bit, called it the M16A2. They also went from 20-round magazines to 30-round magazines, and these are aluminum magazines. They're very lightweight. The two biggest issues I've ever had with an AR-15 or an M16 or any of that family of rifles are either magazine issues, where your magazine's all bunged up for some reason, and lack of lubrication. These rifles like to be lubricated. But what really happened was that in 1964, we came out with a rifle that could go toe-to-toe with the AK as far as overall usage requirements, because this was an intermediate weapon supposed to be used at 0 to 300 yards, and this is an intermediate weapon to be used from 0 to 500 yards. And so they're both a lot more, it's certainly a lot better than the M14. So now we're in 2012, the U.S. military adopted the M4 carbine. Now, before I told you about the M16 rifle, and that's what this is. It's a rifle. And the reason why it's a rifle is because it has longer than an 18-inch barrel. And the U.S. Army says that a rifle must have at least an 18-inch barrel or longer. So in 2012, they decided to adopt the M4, and the M4 only has a 14.5-inch barrel, so they couldn't call it a rifle. They had to call it a carbine. So this is the M4 carbine. So that's why it went from M16 to M4, because they're a different series of rifles, or they're a different series of firearms. This is a rifle, this is a carbine. This M4 is actually, it was originally adopted in 1994 for limited use for armored units, mechanized units, going in and out of cars, because this length of rifle barrel, 20 inches, is pretty long, and it's kind of hard to get in and out of a car with. So Colt, and if we step in the Wayback Machine for just a minute, if we go back to 1971, Colt came up with a little different version of the M16. This is the Colt 651. And the Colt 651 is basically just an M16 with a 14.5-inch barrel. So it's, for all intents and purposes, the same gun. This was actually built to, there was a requirement that the U.S. military had for a new carbine, and Colt built this and tried to sell it to them, and they weren't interested. So fast forward 50 years later or so, the military said, hey, we're a mechanized force now, everyone's in Humvees, everyone's in vehicles, we don't want to bang around our 20-inch rifles anymore, we're going to go ahead and adopt something a little shorter, and so they adopted the M4 carbine. This is M14A1, or excuse me, M4A1 variant, so it's got the quad rail on there with the RAS system, and It has that 14.5-inch barrel. It has a SOP mod stock. These are all updates basically to the same platform. And I think what's really amazing about this whole platform is that this is an M4, right? This is a rifle that the lower receiver was manufactured in 2017. And I can take this, and what's cool is I can use a bullet tip to disassemble all this stuff. But I can take this rifle and I can go ahead and pull the top off, and I can take this rifle that was made in 1970 and I can take this upper receiver that was made in 1970 and I can put it right on this receiver. I'm going to do it. That was made in 2017. So it still interchanges. All these parts interchange for the most part. I can even take this lower receiver and go ahead and put it on this M4 upper, and it still works the exact same way. And and it's like, well, why do you do that? Well, I do that to show you that from 1964, this rifle really didn't change. The only thing that's really changed is metallurgy has changed, so the barrels are a little better now, the coatings that they use are a little better now, but really overall, it's the same gun. And what that tells me is it's a system that's very successful, that they didn't have to change very much on, because if you look at any rifle platform or weapon platform and you're telling me that pretty much nothing's changed on the internals from 1964 to 2018, that says that it's a pretty good platform. So that's kind of from then to now. Currently the military uses the M4 series of rifles, and this is kind of a military display that I'm showing you, even though these are all civilian rifles that are either made to look like military rifles or they were originally military rifles that were converted. Unfortunately, none of these have happy switches. They're not full auto. But these are rifles that you can get currently today. So this M4 right here is based... If you have an Ar15, you want to go ahead and hand me that rifle right there. So this is an entry-level Ar15. I think this is a Wyndham Weaponry. This is a really high-quality rifle. These go for about $700 or $800. If you build a rifle, you can make them for a little less, even with very high-quality parts. And I really gravitate towards these guns for a couple reasons. And I'm actually I'm kind of go back to the Bible in this, and that is when Jesus said, if you don't have a sword, buy one. We know that one of the swords that was shown to him by his disciples was one that was used by Peter to slice off the ear of one of the men that came to get Jesus. And so we know that it was really a sword. It wasn't a butter knife. He didn't stand there and hold the guy's ear and slice it off. He tried to cut the guy's head off, and he juked and dived, and he only cut his ear off. Well, that tells me that rifle, or excuse me, not rifle, sorry. That tells me that sword is longer than a dagger, you know. And then at the same time, when Jesus is asking them, you know, if they don't have a sword to buy one, if they were carrying around a big broadsword, he wouldn't have to say, if you have one, or no, if you don't have one. He wouldn't have to say that. He'd just say, hey, that sword that's on your side. So I know that it was concealable, but I also know it was big enough to actually do some serious damage. And in looking at history, I find that there are only a couple swords that meet that fill that bill at the time, and they were both the primary service weapons for armies. One was what's called a philadius, which is a Greek short sword, which I'm kind of leaning towards they probably had, because a lot of those would have been in surplus. Because they used to be part of the Hellenic Empire, you know, with Alexander the Great. he conquered that whole area, and he had Grecian armies, and all those guys in Greece had philadiuses, short swords, 24 to 28 inches long, and they were heavy on the top, so you could actually slice or slash with them. Or a Roman short sword. And a Roman short sword, we've probably seen the gladius. Everyone's seen a gladius. They're anywhere from 24 to 28 inches. And the reason why I mention that is that those weapons are both used for offense and defense. You would be well equipped as a soldier if you would have had that sword back then. One thing is, those swords were illegal. You could not own one unless you were a Roman citizen. But those swords could be easily concealed, and you could use them for defense, because probably the guy attacking you would have one too. And you could also use it for offense. So you could protect someone else with that sword. So the reason why I gravitate towards the Ar15 is that the Ar15 is basically the short sword of modern era. And that is, this rifle can be used to defend yourself. It's lightweight, it's easily portable. It's easily used by both men and women. It's accurate. It's just a good overall rifle that's easily controllable, and I can use it to defend my family, or I can use it to protect someone else. So I can have both that defensive and offensive role, just like I think that the short sword that Jesus was talking about did. And that's a little conjecture in there. I don't know 100%. I'm kind of filling in some of the blanks, but that's where I'm coming from. And I really think that, especially as men, we need to be able to protect our families. And I think to adequately do that, you have to have something that you can both defend your family with, and you can also defend others with. Because we need to be able to do that. I mean, we're living in perilous times. There are a lot of people that, I'm not even talking about, like Brother Robert getting slapped in the face. He needs to turn the other cheek. What I'm talking about is, hey, someone breaking into your house. It happens. And having a rifle like this, you're going to be able to stop basically anything. So that's kind of my presentation for the M4. And if you have any questions, now's the time to ask. So anyone have any questions? Want to know a little bit more about the history? Want to know a little bit more about the rifles in general? Or did I cover everything? Shoot.
I just got to save you from the people paying too close attention on the video portion. You kept saying 36 instead of 63 for the length on the 30-06 cartridge.
Did I?
Yeah.
Oh man, no, it's 7.62 by 63 millimeter on 30-06. I get them mixed up sometimes. I don't like the metric system at all, because it was developed by communist socialists. So I'm not really too keen on it. I'd rather say 30-06 and 223, but a lot of people don't know what I'm saying when I'm saying that.